The cameras were already running when the boxer laughed. It was meant to be harmless, a comment about speed, a gesture made in front of a small group who assumed nothing serious would follow. 6 seconds later, the room was quiet in a way no one expected. There was no strike worth replaying, no dramatic exchange, only a moment that forced witnesses to reconsider what they thought speed looked like and what restraint could do when it was fully controlled. The film set was not designed for confrontation. It was a controlled space, busy but familiar, where cables ran along the floor and lights were adjusted without urgency. Crew members moved with the quiet efficiency that comes from repetition. This was work, not spectacle. Bruce Lee was already there when most people arrived. He was not positioned as the center of attention. On that day, he was simply part of the production, consulting on movement, blocking scenes, adjusting details others overlooked. To some, he appeared small against the equipment and the framed confidence of trained performers. His presence did not demand silence, it invited routine. Those who had worked around him before understood this pattern. He rarely announced himself. He spoke little unless precision was required. When he demonstrated something, it was usually to clarify timing or spacing, not to impress. On set, efficiency mattered more than reputation. The cameras were being prepared for a separate sequence. They were not meant to capture anything notable beyond scheduled takes. A few crew members lingered near the edge of the space, watching casually as technicians tested angles. Conversations overlapped, laughter came and went. In environments like this, assumptions form quickly. Martial artists are often expected to perform. Boxers are expected to dominate space. Actors are expected to exaggerate motion for the frame. The set encouraged these categories. Everyone knew where they fit, until someone didn't. Bruce Lee did not look like a challenge. He wasn't warming up. He wasn't shadowboxing. He stood relaxed, weight evenly distributed, posture unforced. His hands rested naturally, not raised in readiness. To an untrained eye, there was nothing remarkable happening. This absence of display was easily misread. Among the crew were individuals with athletic backgrounds, fighters, trainers, men accustomed to measuring skill through visible exertion. Speed, in their experience, announced itself. It came with noise, muscle tension, visible effort. It left marks. Lee offered none of that. The environment rewarded confidence spoken aloud. Quiet competence was harder to register. In such spaces, commentary often fills the gap left by uncertainty, not maliciously, almost instinctively. No one anticipated a turning point. There was no sense of anticipation, no gathering crowd. The set continued to function as it always had. People assumed that if something unusual were about to happen, they would feel it in advance. They did not. What existed instead was a subtle imbalance, one person operating outside expectation, surrounded by others who believed they understood the limits of speed, power, and control. The conditions were ordinary, the oversight was human. And in that ordinary setting, a single comment would soon shift the room, not through confrontation, but through contrast. The assumption had already been made, it simply hadn't been tested yet. The boxer was not introduced as a challenger. He did not arrive with intent, nor did he seek attention. His presence on the set was practical, invited through association, familiar to a few members of the crew, comfortable in spaces where physical skill was discussed openly. He carried himself with the ease of someone who had spent years being certain of his own timing. His confidence was not loud, it did not need to be. It was reinforced by routine, rounds measured in minutes, combinations drilled until instinctive, reactions tested under pressure. In his world, speed was visible. It could be counted, timed, and compared. It obeyed rules. As the day progressed, small observations were exchanged. Movements were noticed. Techniques were mentioned in passing. The boxer watched as Bruce Lee adjusted a sequence for the camera, demonstrating distance, correcting foot placement, simplifying a motion until it required almost no effort. To the boxer, it looked incomplete. What he saw did not match his framework. There was no guard raised high, no bounce in the feet, no tension before movement. Lee's motions appeared economical to the point of being understated. Useful for choreography, perhaps, but not for a real exchange. The comment, when it came, was not sharp. It was casual, almost conversational. A remark about speed, about how movement on film could deceive the eye, about how certain styles looked fast until they met resistance. It was delivered without hostility, but it was public enough to be heard by those nearby. In another setting, it might have passed without notice, but on a film set, with cameras rolling and professionals present, words carry weight. The comment framed Bruce Lee as a specialist limited by context, quick for the screen, but untested by familiar measures of combat. The boxer spoke from experience. His confidence was earned. He had faced opponents who moved unpredictably, who tried to overwhelm with flurries. He had learned to read shoulders, hips, breath. Speed, to him, was something you could prepare for. He did not raise his voice. He did not challenge Lee directly. He simply spoke as someone certain that what he knew applied universally. A few people smiled. Others said nothing. No one corrected him. Bruce Lee listened without reaction. There was no shift in posture, no tightening of the jaw. He did not interrupt or defend himself. His eyes stayed calm, attentive, as if the comment were technical rather than personal. That response, or lack of one, was noticed. In spaces governed by hierarchy, silence can mean concession. Some assumed Lee had no interest in engaging. Others assumed the comment had landed. The boxer, sensing no resistance, felt affirmed. His certainty settled deeper. There was no reason, he thought, to take the moment seriously. He had not challenged a man. He had challenged an idea. And in doing so, he believed he already understood the outcome. The room, however, was beginning to change, not through raised tension, but through expectation. Attention shifted subtly. Conversations slowed. The set remained functional, yet something unspoken took hold. No one asked for a demonstration. No terms were set. But the space between assumption and reality had narrowed, and it would not remain empty for long. The shift did not announce itself. There was no clear moment when the set stopped being routine and became something else. It happened gradually, in the way attention collects without instruction. A technician paused with a cable still in hand. A camera operator delayed resetting a frame. Conversations thinned, then ended. The boxer's comment lingered, not because it was provocative, but because it had been left unanswered. In working environments, silence often feels heavier than disagreement. People wait for cues. Someone usually fills the space with explanation or humor. No one did. Bruce Lee remained where he was. He did not reposition himself or signal intent. His body language offered no escalation. If anything, he appeared less engaged, as though the moment required no effort at all. That restraint unsettled a few observers. The boxer noticed it as well. Confidence, when unchallenged, expects acknowledgement. It expects either agreement or refusal. What it does not expect is quiet consideration. A few seconds passed. Someone cleared their throat. Another crew member glanced toward the camera, uncertain whether it should still be running. It was. This was not a face-off. There was no clearing of space, no formal distance established. People stood where they already were. The proximity was incidental, not deliberate. That proximity mattered. The boxer adjusted his stance slightly, not a fighting posture, but a habitual realignment. Years of training expressed themselves unconsciously. His weight shifted, his shoulders squared. Bruce Lee did not mirror the movement. He did not step back or forward. His feet remained where they had been, aligned not for balance under force, but for neutrality. Witnesses would later struggle to describe what they felt in that moment. There was no threat, no anticipation of violence, and yet the room had become attentive in a way that did not require instruction. Speed, in most minds, is associated with preparation. Muscles tense, breathing changes, energy gathers. None of that was visible. Lee's stillness created a different metric. It suggested that if something were to happen, it would not be preceded by warning. That possibility alone was enough to quiet the room. The boxer's expression shifted, not to concern, but to focus. He became aware, perhaps for the first time, that he was being watched, not judged, but observed. The audience had not chosen sides, they had chosen to wait. No one asked a question. No one stepped in. The cameras continued to roll, capturing nothing remarkable, just two men standing within a few feet of each other, surrounded by professionals who sensed that explanation would soon give way to demonstration. Bruce Lee finally moved, but not toward the boxer. He spoke briefly to a crew member, his tone unchanged, clarifying a technical point unrelated to the exchange. This, more than anything, reinforced the imbalance. He was not preparing to respond. He was continuing his work. That composure reframed the moment. The boxer's comment, once casual, now seemed exposed, not aggressive enough to demand response, but present enough to require resolution. The silence did not pressure Lee. It pressured the assumption. And in that quiet, inevitability began to form, not as excitement, but as acceptance that something simple was about to settle what words had complicated. No one knew how. They only sensed that when it happened, it would be brief. There was no signal that it was about to happen, no verbal agreement, no invitation. The demonstration emerged from the same stillness that had defined the moment before it. Bruce Lee shifted his weight, not as preparation, but as adjustment. It was the kind of movement people make when stepping around equipment or repositioning for comfort. Nothing about it suggested intent. The boxer noticed too late. What followed occupied less time than it takes to register surprise. Witnesses would later disagree on the exact sequence, not because it was complex, but because it was difficult to observe while happening. There was no visible wind-up, no acceleration curve the eye could track. Lee's hand moved and returned to rest. That was it. No strike landed with force, no one was pushed back. The boxer remained standing, uninjured, untouched in any dramatic sense, yet something had passed between them, something undeniable. Those closest to the exchange described a sensation rather than an image, a displacement of expectation, a realization that space had been crossed and reclaimed before the mind could react. The boxer felt it first. He had not been hit. There was no pain to process, but he became acutely aware of how close Lee's hand had been, close enough that the outcome could have been different by choice alone. The distance he believed protected him had not existed. Bruce Lee did not hold his position. He did not maintain proximity or wait for acknowledgement. His posture returned immediately to neutral, as though the motion had never occurred. The camera captured the aftermath, not the act. The boxer's eyes shifted, searching for confirmation from those around him. He did not speak. His breathing changed slightly, not from exertion, but from recalibration. The certainty he had brought into the space had been interrupted, not shattered, but adjusted beyond repair. There was no reaction from Lee, no expression of satisfaction. He did not look for approval. He simply resumed stillness. That restraint defined the demonstration more than the movement itself. Had there been aggression, the moment might have escalated. Had there been explanation, it might have turned instructional. Instead, Lee offered neither. He had answered the comment at its level, quietly, efficiently, without expanding its importance. The room absorbed the result slowly. Some crew members exchanged glances. Others looked back at their tasks, unsure whether what they had seen warranted attention. The absence of drama made it difficult to respond. There was nothing to applaud, nothing to react against. The boxer nodded once. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it marked the end of the exchange. No words followed. In those few seconds, the hierarchy of assumptions had shifted, not through dominance, but through clarity. Speed redefined not as motion, but as timing. Power revealed not as force, but as control. Bruce Lee had not demonstrated what he could do. He had demonstrated what he chose not to do. And in doing so, he left nothing further to prove. The moment did not conclude with acknowledgement or retreat. It dissolved back into the rhythm of the set, as though nothing formal had occurred. Equipment was adjusted, a light was repositioned, someone checked a monitor, work resumed. But the boxer did not return to conversation. He remained where he was for a moment longer than necessary, his attention turned inward. What had unsettled him was not fear or embarrassment, it was the absence of a familiar reference point. There had been no exchange to analyze, no mistake to correct. In boxing, feedback is immediate. You feel what lands, you know where you were late or open. Here, there was nothing tangible to process, only the certainty that timing had been taken from him without effort. He replayed the moment privately, attempting to reconstruct it. There was no answer that fit his training. The movement had not violated rules, it had simply ignored them. When he finally spoke, it was not to challenge or explain, it was to acknowledge. He did not raise his voice or seek the group's attention. The words were directed to Lee alone, measured and quiet, an admission that what he had seen did not align with what he understood. That speed, as he had defined it, was incomplete. Bruce Lee listened, as he had before. He did not correct the boxer or expand on the lesson. He offered no commentary on method or philosophy. A brief response, respectful and neutral, ended the exchange. There was no mentorship claimed, no hierarchy asserted. That absence mattered. The boxer adjusted his posture, not defensively, but deliberately. He no longer stood as someone testing a boundary. He stood as someone who had encountered one. The laughter that had existed earlier did not return, not because the room had become tense, but because the tone had shifted. Casual judgment had been replaced by caution, not fear, awareness. Crew members later remarked on how quickly the moment passed and how long its effect lingered. The boxer remained on set, but his role changed subtly. He observed more, he spoke less. When movement was discussed, he listened. There was no humiliation in this shift. It was internal, a recalibration of certainty. The demonstration had not defeated him, it had bypassed him. That distinction stayed with him. For Bruce Lee, the matter was already closed. He did not revisit it. He did not reference it in conversation or gesture toward its significance. To him, the exchange had served its function and required no reinforcement. The boxer, however, would carry it beyond the set. Not as a story of being overpowered, but as an encounter with something that resisted classification. A reminder that mastery does not always announce itself, and that restraint can be more instructive than force. The lesson was not spoken aloud. It was accepted quietly. And in that acceptance, the real impact of the 6 seconds began to take shape, long after the cameras stopped paying attention. The incident did not circulate immediately. There was no report filed, no footage promoted, no attempt to preserve the moment as evidence. The film was processed and archived like any other material from that day. If the 6 seconds existed on tape, they were never framed as something to be studied. What remained was memory. Years later, people who had been on that set would mention the moment in passing, not as a confrontation, but as an interruption, a brief adjustment in how they understood skill. The details were never embellished. If anything, they were understated, as though exaggeration would distort what made the incident meaningful. The boxer spoke of it only when asked, and even then, without drama. He never claimed to have been challenged or defeated. He described it as being shown a distance he didn't know existed, a gap that could close without warning and without harm. Bruce Lee never referenced the incident publicly. It did not become part of his demonstrations or his teaching material. Those who trained with him later would hear echoes of the lesson, not as a story, but as a standard. Movements reduced to their essential purpose, timing emphasized over strength, control valued above display. In time, the set itself faded from relevance. Films were completed, crews dispersed, careers moved forward. The moment remained. It survived because it resisted spectacle, because it offered no climax to replay, no technique to imitate without understanding. Those who heard about it were often disappointed at first. They expected a display. What they received was an absence. That absence became instructive. The story was told differently by each witness, but the core never changed. A remark made casually, a response delivered quietly, a realization that arrived too late to be stopped. It became one of those incidents referenced not for what happened, but for what didn't need to happen. No escalation, no injury, no dominance asserted beyond what was necessary to correct an assumption. Years later, when discussions of speed or power arose, someone would eventually mention that day, not to elevate Bruce Lee, but to recalibrate the conversation, as a reminder that mastery often reveals itself only once, and only to those paying attention. The 6 seconds were never measured. They were remembered, not as footage, but as silence.